Imagine, you're booting up a game and immediately you get your teeth kicked in. Well, that's pretty much the experience with games like Dark Souls, Cuphead, Ninja Gaiden, Ghosts and Goblins, XCOM 2, Hollow Knight, Contra, and even Flappy Bird. They're all infamous for their brutal difficulty, but also, they're incredibly popular and well reviewed. Then on the flip side, you've got games like Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, Mario Kart, Spyro, and The Sims, which are just as popular, but known for being accessible and easygoing. So that begs the question, does difficulty actually impact the quality of a video game? Is there a real connection between a game's challenge and how good it is? And more importantly, does one style of game, hard or easy, actually make for a better experience? Well, that's what I want to dive into today. So first of all, I'd like to talk about different types of difficulty. If you were to follow the rules of something like Call of Duty or shooters of a similar nature, where a higher difficulty just means raising the health and damage of enemies while also lowering yours, or games like Need for Speed, where even the crappiest car can match your speed and hit sharp turns at top speed, then this is what I'd call cheap difficulty. Because rather than adjusting the game to make the enemy or the AI smarter, or employing the use of tactics, positioning, and things like that, it creates soldiers that are bullet sponges and cars that resemble rocket-fueled wheelie bins in a cheap way of increasing the difficulty with minimal effort, essentially making the game cheat against you. And then you'd have what I'd consider fair difficulty, which is games like Alien Isolation or Metal Gear Solid 5, where although you can still choose your difficulty, there's an adaptive AI where the game or enemies adjust themselves to match your playstyle, but in a way that still feels immersive and manageable, without making you feel cheated or like the rug's been pulled out from under you. And then lastly, at least for this video, is intended difficulty, which is games like Dark Souls, Hollow Knight, Mario 64, or Breath of the Wild that don't have any difficulty options and can only be played in the way the developer intended, which although does offer less options, does allow for the developer to really refine the player experience and give them more creative freedom without trying to cater to multiple difficulty modes. And now that I've defined what I perceive to be different types of difficulty, I'd like to go on to the argument as to why difficult games are good. And if you're a regular viewer of my content, you won't be surprised to hear my specific example is from Software, whether it's Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, or my personal favourite Sekiro. It's hard to deny that any of these games would be as popular as they are if it wasn't for their sometimes overwhelming difficulty, especially since most discussions from any of these games is people talking about how they beat whichever boss first try, or some poor soul asking for help on Reddit, only to be left with a barrage of comments saying "get good, scrub." And there's tons of videos on YouTube with hundreds of thousands of views trying to show other players how to get past certain sections, beat certain bosses, or to find different weapons and armor. But regardless of whether we're talking about any of FromSoft's games, or games like Cuphead, Hollow Knight, Super Meat Boy, or even something like Flappy Bird, the reason they got popular, at least from my point of view, is because people like to be engaged in what they're doing, and they like to be challenged. It's not so much that these games are just harder than other games, but more so that its difficulty finds a way to immerse you, making you think for yourself and discover the game in a way that's more dynamic, while also rewarding you for overcoming it. So whether it's clearing a difficult level, beating a specific boss, or just getting the high score on some mobile game, people love it because they like to feel like they've accomplished something. And whether we like to admit it or not, we love to feel like we're better than other people at something. Not because we want to rub it in anyone's face, at least not usually anyway, but because we like to have that thing where we can say, "Look at me, I did this really difficult thing and I feel good about it." And that's a perfectly okay thing to think. For example, when I finally beat Ishin the Sword Saint for the first time in Sekiro after months and months of trying, I leapt from my sofa, almost launching my controller into the ceiling, shouting in absolute joy. And it's honestly one of the most exciting experiences of my entire life as a gamer. And even though I wouldn't in any way class myself as a trophy hunter, I'll still show off my Sekiro platinum every chance I get. See, I'm doing it right now. But also, I see the rise in difficult games over the last 10 years or so as a bit of a pushback to the AAA Ghost Train ride that just fills its games with quest markers, QTEs, and tons of hand-holding, making you feel like you could complete the game blindfolded. And now that I've spoken about why difficult games are good, I'd like to move on to why difficult games are bad, or more broadly, why games shouldn't be difficult. I think the main and probably most fair argument against difficulty is accessibility. Using my earlier example of games, there are plenty of people out there that for whatever reason can't or just don't want to go through with dying over and over and over again while playing a game. Whether that's because of a physical or mental condition that makes it impossible to play or cope with the stress of constant trial and error, or they simply only get so much time in a week to actually sit down and play games and don't want to spend it fighting the same boss 8 times in a row. But along with that, there's so many games that just wouldn't have the same following or marketability if it was somehow made harder. Take any Mario game for instance. Although certain sections can pose a bit more of a challenge than others, and getting 100% can put you to the test, in general, they're not made to be difficult, and can be easily played by almost anyone of any age, and the series probably wouldn't have remained so popular if it was any harder, since a lot of adults that still play them now would have probably found it too stressful as kids, and in turn wouldn't have introduced their own kids to it. And then you have games like Stardew Valley. Its accessibility and relaxing nature is absolutely what defines the game. The reason I and so many other people enjoy it is because you can just sit back, relax, maybe chuck on a podcast or some music, and just enjoy watering your crops, feeding your animals, and just living out your best farm life. If it required specifically timed inputs every time you planted or harvested something, and needed specific prompts and actions for just chopping a bit of wood, it would take away from the overall experience and make everything feel like so much more of a chore. So although difficulty can be a rewarding experience, it can also completely kill an experience. Now, one of the main things people discuss when it comes to difficult games is the inclusion of difficulty and accessibility options. And I know I've sort of brushed past this already, but I do want to focus on it a bit more now. And when it comes to accessibility options, I'm in full support of it. I don't believe anyone should be excluded from the joys of gaming because of a physical or mental disability, and it's not going to hurt the development or production company to just go that extra mile and offer people that need it a way of being able to play their games. But when it comes to difficulty options, my views get a bit more wibbly wobbly, especially since certain difficulty options can also be viewed as accessibility options. So things like aim assist, auto press to replace QTEs, and things like that. But if we look at games that are more traditionally tiered in a similar way to your typical easy, normal, and hard approach, then I feel like developers shouldn't feel pressured into having their artistic view in what they're creating be altered to appease people that have the ability to play their games. Because if they did, I really don't think that games like the ones I mentioned earlier would have been as much of a cultural phenomenon. Because it's that word of mouth from people discussing their favourite bosses and how they got through certain sections that piqued the interest of other players, and probably what convinced them to buy the game and eventually go off and discuss it with others themselves. But these games do have the disadvantage of being more inaccessible to people with certain types of physical issues. So to answer the original question of does difficulty affect the quality in a video game, I'd have to say yes. Because if a developer sets it too high or low for the type of game they're making and the type of audience they want to attract, then the overall experience and immersion is going to be severely affected. Both easy and hard games are just as good as each other, provided the difficulty matches the tone and intended experience you're supposed to get from each specific game. That's the video. Thank you for watching. While you're here, why don't you tell me what the hardest video game you've ever played is? And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.